So welcome everybody. My name is Latasha Kaffrobe. I am the program manager for Map the System Canada. Thank you for registering to participate in Map the System 2021. As always, I wish you the best in your research over the next couple of weeks here as you prepare for the final submission date. For everyone joining us, if you have not done so, please feel free to drop your name and your institution into the chat box so that we can get a sense of where everyone is joining from today. We ask that you remain muted for the majority of the call. Catherine Mcgowan, the Associate Professor of Social Innovation from Mount Royal University, will be leading today's session on systems and identifying a systems challenge. After she has finished her presentation, we will open up the floor for some questions for students. If you have any questions, please feel free to do so. Please collect any questions that you have, either writing them down or dropping them into the chat box. Catherine, I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself so that I don't get all your titles wrong. We are very grateful to have Catherine join us and lead this session today.
Thanks, Tash. Hello, bonjour, and ok, everyone. My name is Catherine Mcgowan. Tash and I and Amy are coming at you from the beautiful and slightly less frigid home of the Niitsitapi people here in what is now southern Alberta, which is also, of course, the location of Treaty 7, which includes the Niitsitapi, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations, as well as home to Métis Nation Region 3. We are all treaty people and have a responsibility to ensure that we work together. We didn't plan that. I just was thinking about how it's finally not completely frigid here in Napi's playground. And so it's just kind of nice to remember and remind ourselves of that. I'm so excited to see so many people on this call. I just hope that we can live up to your expectations. So Tash and I were talking about the need to sort of just take a moment at this early stage in your research and come together and talk about systems thinking and systems problems so that you can go forward no matter what problem you're looking at, no matter what approach you're taking, with a strong sense of that you are part of a community. I'm part of a community that thinks about systems. And so what I will do, and because this is, I'm still a professor, still think about things this way, I do have some slides, which I think we can make available to you guys afterwards. But I'll go through sort of a few broad questions that I think are really relevant for early stages of this process. And the first is sort of really thinking critically about what is systems thinking and why do we use systems thinking, and how can we help ourselves define a specific systems problem? And then secondly, and perhaps more ambiguously, but also very importantly, how do we draw boundaries on our analysis? Now, I'm hopeful that I won't talk too much and that we'll actually leave a lot of opportunity for questions. It's been my experience, both in the classroom and outside of it, that that's where we tend to get to the meat of the issue, if you will. And I say that as a vegetarian, so, keep that in mind. But the point is, we do want to leave a lot of space for you to feel that you have an opportunity to respond and interact sort of in a safe and equal playing field. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'll take you through. I have two tools I want to introduce you to that may be useful in your analysis, but you of course get to make that choice as thoughtful systems thinkers yourself. But I hope this will be a useful process for everyone. So I'm going to share my screen. There we are. Okay. There we are. We are a Google school with Google Classroom. So if we were in Google, I'd be like bang, bang, bang. And in Zoom, I'm still a little bit, even though it's almost the same functionality, there's just a little bit of a gap between where I want to be and where I am. So if things seem a bit odd, I apologize. So our big question today is, what is your system and how can we help you refine the kinds of questions you're asking so that you feel confident about what we're doing? I have 3 sub-goals. One is sort of thinking about, do you have a systems problem? Are you approaching your problem from a systems lens? And in that respect, I want to introduce you to, or reintroduce you to, the Iceberg, which is a very popular tool. So some of you will have heard it before. There's no harm in rehashing it. Number two, can we draw effective boundaries? And in this, I want to introduce you to what I think is a very emancipatory tool in this process, and hopefully you will feel so as well. And lastly, our third sub goal is that we want to leave a lot of time for questions so that we can share, exchange, and discuss where you're at and where you want to be. So those are our sub goals. I'll start with the big one. So do you have a systems problem? Now, a lot of you have already given a lot of thought to what you want to do and how you want to do it. So what I am not suggesting here is that I want to introduce you to an entirely new set of questions, but instead I want to remind you of kind of the 6 principles of systems thinking that we often discuss in the context of change making, and then think about how you can connect that to where you have already been. So first of all, when we think about systems thinking for change making, we often think about sort of some problems or sets of problems where one of or all 6 of these apply. So it's not that you have to sort of go through and check all 6, but we tend to find that problems that benefit from a systems thinking approach are ones that demonstrate at least 2, if not more, of these elements, if you will. They're not criteria, they're descriptive. So the first is that the problem you're interested in is chronic and it defies people's best intentions or efforts to solve it. So there's something about this issue, and I'm going to use problem and issue interchangeably because a lot of times we're also talking about kind of the status quo and how the status quo may actually be making problems for people. So I want to acknowledge that tension, that we sometimes don't even necessarily have a common agreement that there is a problem, but we may need to expose that for more people to see. So that's why I'm using problem and issue interchangeably. So like I said, the first issue is that it's chronic. So it's happening over time, and people may try to work on it, but it seems to be defying people's best interests, attentions, or efforts to solve it. This is particularly true if we find that those efforts are kind of siloed, both across the sectors and within sectors. So if we find that the public sector and private sector may both be working on this, but not working together, or the not-for-profit sector may be contributing, but again, not working together. And we also see that siloing often within a sector in response to this chronic issue. Number 2, we find that there are diverse, relevant stakeholders who are engaged in this issue, but they find it either difficult or impossible to align their efforts despite shared intentions. So here we're thinking about the fact that people from a wide variety of organizations, approaches, and even sectors may want to work together, but find it either challenging or practically impossible. So that's a common element we find with systems problems, is that we actually often don't we are either unable to bring everyone together, or there is some sort of impediment that is making it more challenging to do that kind of meaningful work. Number 3, the stakeholders have or continue to try to increase or optimize their part without fully understanding their impact on the whole. So that one takes a little bit of unpacking. But really what we're getting at here is that when we look at efforts to solve the problem, sometimes we find competition between potential change makers who are sort of trying to carve out either as much attention or focus that they can, or simply trying to own it, try to say like, I have the solution and other people aren't listening to me. Sometimes we call this heropreneurship, where you sort of think, I'm going to solve all the world's problems with my own 2 hands and my big brain. And while we definitely think everyone on this call has the capacity to make amazing change, when we tend to see that behavior pop up, where people are sort of interpreting their actions as zero sum, even if the problem seems to demand interagency and interdisciplinary cooperation, that's a good indication we may need that systems perspective to help us work through that. Number 4, the short-term effects may actually undermine durable solutions. So if you're looking at something where what we often refer to as a Band-Aid doesn't seem to deal with the deep problems, the values, the culture, that's a good indication you may want a systems approach, because that will help you move beyond those kinds of short-term Band-Aid solutions and more into deep, meaningful sort of engagement with the problem itself. Number 5, people are working on a large number of diverse initiatives at the same time. So that one's just descriptive. Like you actually find, if you go into this any kind of community, you find that there's 10 organizations that are all committed to the same issue, but they're not working together. We have this, by the way, in Calgary in a really sort of unfortunate way. We have so many pet rescues. And I think that's partially, there's a number of reasons why that is, but they don't work together and it doesn't help us actually solve the problem of homeless kitties. Which is terrible. There should be no homeless kitties. I'm a cat person, if you can't tell. And Molly may come in. She likes to participate in these things. Number 6, promoting a particular solution comes at the expense of continuous learning. So this one we tend to find, especially when we look at political solutions to complex problems, is that people will say, this will solve it, and then we don't have to pay attention to it anymore. It's done. And we see this in a number of issues, both in Canada and more broadly, where we have these kinds of deep systems issues that require long-term learning. And people sort of say, but, you know, we passed that commission, or we had our recommendations. Why hasn't this solved it? And that's a good indication you need a systems approach. So as I said, these are sort of 6 indicators that you may want to think about a systems approach for any particular problem. It's not that all 6 will necessarily always be relevant, but they tend to pop up at least 2, if not more, when we look at systems problems, particularly when we are focused on systems change. So this leads us to sort of 2 elements here. So the first is why use systems thinking when these things show up, and the second is how to approach your problem from a systems perspective. So we'll start with why using systems thinking, and this may be old hat for many people, but I still think it's important to say. So first of all, we want to use systems thinking if we are trying to make a change in the world. And despite our best time and our best effort, we are seeing little to no change in that issue, or even worse, it's getting worse over time. So if you have been involved in a social movement on any issue in the environment, on social justice, and you have been putting in hours and putting in effort, and perhaps you're the 4th or 5th generation to be putting in hours and effort, and you're not seeing that kind of systems change, or you're not seeing, it might even be getting worse, that's a good indication that a systems thinking approach could be helpful. It could potentially identify spaces to act and people with whom to act that could improve the likelihood of sort of moving the needle, for lack of a better term. And number 2, and this is more where I sit as an academic, is that, you know, you're looking to measure or understand a specific question or intervention to find out sort of why it is that you haven't seen that change. So why it is that either existing evaluation tools or action methods don't seem to be making a meaningful shift in the system itself. And I have actually published several studies where I've used systems thinking to ask this question, and it's been a very interesting process. The key, however, I want to emphasize before we move on is that chances are most of us will find ourselves on one of those 2 points that's for using systems thinking. Map the system has a little bit of both. We start with the latter and we move into the former, as we especially move with apprenticing with a problem. But the key here is that it's not that we are treating systems thinking as the panacea, the answer to all questions, but instead we are acknowledging the fact that oftentimes our more established ways of answering questions and ways of planning and ways of intervening may be insufficient to deal with the kinds of world that we actually live in. You know, we have these boundaries we've put on our world, things like disciplines and geographies, and they help us make decisions, but they also limit our capacity to understand and fully grasp the social systems in which we function. And so we sometimes therefore need to take that step back and ask, do we need this other different approach? So now that I've sort of said that, and you're thinking, oh God, do I actually have a systems problem? Here are some ways that you can sort of think about the issue you're focusing on and think about bringing that systems lens. So the first one is, does it demand an interdisciplinary approach? Does something about the way you're looking at it sort of seem to ask for multiple ways of answering questions, potentially even multiple epistemologies? Secondly, does the problem seem to live or influence the local and personal, as well as potentially citywide, provincial, municipal, or beyond? So do we see it acting at different levels? It doesn't have to act the same way, but do we see it acting at those different levels? That's a good indication you're focusing on a systems problem. Number 3, does it seem to have both fast and slow moving elements? So does it have things that are in the news, and does it also have things that have a long history? That's a good indication, again, you're dealing with the systems element or systems focus in your problem. Number 5, does it have parts or elements that seem stuck, but others that change? So there's some things that seem to be very, very difficult to change. Either, people hard to get out of power, or laws that are hard to undo, or economic activity that seems very difficult to shift. But on the other hand, we see other elements that are changing all the time, potentially changing in response to issues, but also just changing as the system shifts. It's another indication you're dealing with the systems problem. So now that we've sort of asked ourselves these questions and we've given it some thought, what do we do about it? Well, this is where the iceberg comes in. So the iceberg is probably one of the most popular social innovation thinking tools I've certainly encountered over the last decade, which gives you some idea of how long I've been working in the systems and social innovation space. Just thought about it, just realized it's been a full decade. So that makes me feel old. But we often start above the water with our kind of observations of everyday activities. And that's usually where we start, even with Map the System. We've read something in the news, we've had a personal experience, or someone close to us has had a personal experience that piques that little part of our brain that says, could something else be here? Is there something else that can explain this? And so we start above the water with those everyday activities, those things that we observe. Where we then can start to pick out specifically our systems problem is when we start to move below the water to those next level down. So underneath the water, underneath our everyday activities, we have patterns of activities. These are sort of the activities repeated over time. Underneath that, we tend to have structures. Those are both social structures, so the sort of the clubs, the organizations you're part of, but also more formal or physical structures. Beneath that, we tend to have reward systems. So how we both punish what we want, what we don't like, and how we celebrate or reward what we do like. And the we here is important. That is usually a reference to the broad systems focus. So what is the system rewarding? What is the system punishing? Or what do those in power in the system have chosen to reward or punish? And beneath those reward systems, we very deep into the water, but very critically, we have values, beliefs, and norms. And those are often, they're not the kind of things we express every day. Those are things like our sort of broadly held and very difficult to articulate values that justify all of these other elements. So let me take a moment and just do this sort of on a relatively silly example, but I think it'll be helpful to think about. So I said it's been very cold in Calgary. Well, today was only -22 with a wind chill of -33. Double thumbs up. That's way warmer than it's been for the last 6 or 7 days. So I did something I normally do every day. I went for a run outside. So that would be something you would see. If you had been in my neighborhood today, you would have seen a single solitary me running very slowly because I've been running inside for the last week. But that would be above the water, would be that one observation. So if you were sitting in your window in Rutland Park in Calgary, you would have seen me running. Underneath that water, we would sort of look for, were there patterns? Does this person just run once, or do they run every day? And the reality is I do run every day, although as I said, for the last week, it's been inside, so I've just been super unhappy. But then you would sort of, so what we're looking for there is everyday activities over time. More serious issues, this can be things like the frequency of particular negative interactions or the frequency of people's movement. Do people go to work every day at the same time? For instance, do people have similar schedules? Are people having similar negative interactions that can be demonstrated over time? So we're looking here as everyday activities over time. Underneath those patterns, then we look for structures. And this tends to be the spot that's the messiest for people, for students first using the iceberg. So that's why I like to break it into social structures and physical structures. So if we think about my running example, one of the key physical structures is just literally safe sidewalks. Having safe sidewalks with good lighting is really important for running. This is true for most people. I am a settler, so I enjoy certain privileges, and I live in a pretty safe neighborhood, so that also gives me certain privileges. So right there, we can start to see how the system is built to support some people and not to support others. So I live in a safe neighborhood, so I feel like I can go for a run. And as of last year, Calgary finally started punishing people who didn't shovel their sidewalks. I come from Ontario. I see some of my alma mater from University of Waterloo on here. So you guys know they shovel, they don't shovel here. So that new rule or a reward system underneath the structure has made that physical structure more safe for me. But the physical structure in this case would be the sidewalks. Now, when it comes to social structures, here's where things can get a little messy. So I don't belong to any running group, but that could be a social structure. But other possible social structures are things like how people interact with each other. So one of the things that happens to me when I run, and I really, really hate it, is that I get a lot of thumbs up from people. And I think it's because, I'm not the thinnest human being on the planet. So a lot of people, even though I've been running for 20 years, a lot of people are like, oh, she finally started running. And it just hurts. It hurts every time, even though it's meant in a positive way. Now that is a very minor example of a social structure or social sort of behaviors, but we can see how other people don't enjoy the same kind of protections I do, and that can affect their likelihood of going for a run, that thing on top of the water. So right there, the kinds of social structures or social patterns of behavior can make some outcomes more likely and some outcomes less. The reward system piece, here we can think about formal and informal rewards. So I said Calgary finally started punishing people for not shoveling their sidewalk. It's a $750 fine. That is a formal punishment for not doing something. Classic reward system. But there are also informal ones. So for instance, we have a program, and this is somewhat formal, but still gives you some idea of some informal benefits. We have a program in Calgary called the Snow Angel program. So if you shovel other people's front walks, you can sort of win an award for being such a good community member. And there can also be sort of social rewards in terms of having positive relationships with your neighbors. As someone who has shoveled other people's walks, I'll tell you that those awards are often also intrinsic because you often don't get the formal benefit. But we can also see things like formal and informal punishments and formal and informal rewards in my daily run. In the same way that, if you are healthy, people tend to sort of say, wow, you're so healthy. Or my favorite is, wow, you're so dedicated. That's actually in form of an informal reward. I'm being recognized for a particular activity and being praised, and that can affect people's behavior. Similarly, we can see negative sort of rewards in the way that people make comments. So for instance, that idea of people saying, good job, or way to go. I hate way to go. It's like, it doesn't help. And if you've ever said way to go for a runner, don't punish yourself, just don't do it in the future. But we can also see how the way that other people are treated when they run, even just informally, like the way they're looked at or followed, is an example of a punishment that is sort of coming from the next level down, which are deeply held values and beliefs. So we have values about things like exercise that inform how people choose to engage with them. So we know that exercise in Western culture, especially in North America, we tend to praise exercise as a really important thing, partially to get thin. So we have a value in here, whether it's right or wrong, that sort of praises certain body types over others. And that anyone who's on the call has ever experienced that, then you'll know that this is a deeply held value people don't even think about. They'll say things like, oh, you're looking so thin, you look so great. It's like, well, there's lots of reasons you could be thin that are not good at all. That could be related to things like a particular health crisis or potentially sort of an issue of poverty, but we still value on a deep level certain body types over others, and we act accordingly. Similarly, though, there's also other sort of values associated with health. So the mental health benefits that we associate with exercise, and that can be an example of a good value. So we think that it's important to have your life in balance. Not all cultures or not all spaces share these values, however. And if you've ever sort of gone for a run in an environment where these values are not commonly held, you may have experienced some of the expression of those values when people interact with you. Like, why are you doing this? Or aren't you worried about your safety? Or why would someone do this? Those examples of values and beliefs become expressed through things like those interactions, but they're deeply held and they often sit at the bottom. So the thing is, and what I hope I've demonstrated through this, is that each of these layers sit on each other. They are nested in a way, and they inform what happens above and below it. So if you have a value that's sort of in your system that emphasizes, again, a certain body type, that's going to affect what types of reward systems are sort of reinforced. It may also affect where public money gets spent. So that can affect things like the physical structures. It can affect social structures. And then that makes certain patterns of behavior more common and others less so. So the iceberg can be a really helpful tool in moving beyond or deeper from that initial observation that drew you to this, and start to think about why is it that that particular outcome that caught your attention exists, and how can we understand it from that systems perspective. The key is with the strong iceberg is that, like I said, all the pieces sit on each other. You shouldn't have like a freely held, freely floating structure that doesn't make any sense in the rest of the system. The key is to understand how these things interact. And this is in particular, this iceberg tends to be very helpful if you're looking at something that has that kind of built up over time chronic component. Because what we're often looking at there is making the invisible visible, making sort of the choices that have justified, maintained, or created the status quo more visible to a broader number of people, so that they can appreciate how these choices that may seem individually either unrelated or from their perspective innocuous have contributed to this particular outcome that we don't like or that we want to change. So this is, I find, a very helpful tool for not just sort of moving beyond that initial observation that you've had, but also to sort of start organizing your research around your systems problem and to start, again, communicating that to a broader audience. It's kind of a three whammy, if you will. It helps you think, it helps you research, and it helps you communicate those values. And so in some ways, this is perhaps one of the most useful early systems thinking tools that I can give you. So the key here with this pillar, oh, I've talked for so long. The key here for this pillar is to start with our initial observation that got us started, but then to think about, am I bringing a systems lens to this? Am I looking for those 6 elements of systems thinking? And then once I've done that, how can I start to organize my thinking? And the iceberg is a really great way to do that. There will be time for questions at the end. I apologize. I know I'm trying to cover as much as possible. Our second issue that we want to discuss is how you draw effective boundaries on your system. This is difficult. Let me just acknowledge that, okay? This is difficult, and there's not a beautiful way to do this that sort of can be summarized in 3 lines or less, at least not right now. Now, that's not to suggest there aren't good ways of doing it. There absolutely are, but I found that drawing effective boundaries are one of those things that you get better at as you do more and more systems analysis. And it's not just a question of drawing tighter boundaries, but it's also a question of drawing effective ones. So let's look at what we mean by effective boundaries. So generally speaking, when we're talking about boundaries in a social system, this is where we're borrowing ecology language, and it really starts to run us short. So if we think about an ecosystem, there are a point at which the ecosystem shifts to a different sort of state. Now, the point of that overlap is actually called an ecotone, and it tends to be the most interesting and creative spaces. But there is also a point where you're no longer in the mountains. There's a point where you're no longer in the forest. So there are these kinds of, if not discrete, at least relatively experiential boundaries. But when we take that language and we move it into the social sphere, things can get a bit messy. So let's talk about sort of what we mean when we talk about boundaries. So generally speaking, when you think about boundaries in a system, you first have to kind of have an understanding of what system you're actually looking at. And things like the iceberg will help you figure that out. Then you have to figure out the point at which essentially you stop your analysis. Temporally, geographically, culturally, all of these things, you have to think about where you stop. And you don't just stop when it's 20 minutes to when you have to submit. That's not the most sort of most helpful way to do this. Instead, what we really want you to do is figure out that point where which connections no longer contribute to the purpose of your system. So if we think at the most basic that a system has parts, as parts have relationships, and those relationships over time produce outcomes, and that a system has a general purpose, we can actually start to think about where we want to draw our boundaries. It's not that we stop when there are no more connections, but we stop when those connections cease having explanatory power for the purpose of the system in which we are interested. So yesterday I asked my students in my one class to draw the system of Calgary focused on youth. And so we had to define youth. There's a boundary, but then we sort of looked at sort of all the connections that were relevant to people 18 to 24. That was the boundary the students chose, which is not surprising because I think they were 18 to 24. But the key here is it's not that there weren't connections that were beyond their analysis, but those connections ceased having explanatory power for why it was that youth were leaving Calgary. And so that's where they chose to draw their boundaries. In some cases, these are what I like to consider hard boundaries or relatively impermeable ones. So if we look at things like a jurisdictional boundary, so the end of your ability to create laws and enforce them, that's a relatively sort of defined boundary. So you don't carry with you, let's say, speeding rules. So if you go from one province to another, if they have different traffic limits, you can't say, but I'm from Alberta, I'm taking the Alberta speed limit with me. Instead, you've moved into a new jurisdiction, and therefore that may be relevant. So if you're looking at something that has a legal or political element, you may want to look at the jurisdictional limits of the particular sort of government that you're interested in as one of your potential boundaries. You may also want to think about a geographical or environmental boundary. So if you are looking at something like a watershed or a mountain range, it may be more relevant to think about the extent of that ecosystem than it is to just think about the jurisdictions under which part of it falls. So the Rocky Mountains have both Alberta and British Columbia, as well as the United States. And so if we wanted to think about the entire Rocky Mountains, if we just talked about Alberta or just talked about British Columbia, that would be limiting. It would be important to understand those internal problems between those two boundaries, but in terms of understanding the system of the Rocky Mountains, that's the ecological boundaries more relevant because that helps us understand that purpose. There can also be cultural boundaries. So this may be sort of not hard and fast, but it may be easier or more difficult depending on the particular question that you're looking at. In some cases, we draw cultural boundaries where we're interested about sort of the rules of entrance into a particular cultural or subcultural group. So if there are official or unofficial rules about how one becomes a member or how membership is defined, that may be a relevant boundary to look at. However, one of the things that we tend to find in a lot of the systems problems that are discussed in Map the System is that what people are interested in is that point of overlap, that ecotone between potentially two cultural boundaries. So it's possible that a cultural boundary will be relevant for you, and there what you want to think about are the limits of membership and the rules of entry. But realistically, a lot of times what we actually find is that the boundaries that Map the System tends to draw students to are the points of overlap between different cultural boundaries. Generally speaking, though, realistically, a lot of these are going to be artificial. You are going to be imposing them, or they have been imposed on a system by decision makers. So what you want to do is go back to that question of, at what point do these new connections no longer help me understand the purpose of the system or the driving of my question, which is frustrating, I acknowledge. But it's an example of what we call that kind of iterative or reiteration in systems thinking. So you want to kind of constantly ask that question of diverging and converging. Am I going too far? Am I actually am I not? Do I need to sort of focus in my analysis? And this has been my experience, by the way, in a lot of different systems maps, many of them historical, where you can get really you can get really crazy really fast, is that you do have to kind of constantly ask yourself when you're bringing in new pieces, does this new element, this new piece, this new level help me explain the purpose that I am interested in? And this is what leads me to the tool that I feel may be relevant for you here. So this is called the research journey. It's from a paper that's about 7 years old now. And the paper was focused on sort of how to study complex problems. Now, we haven't discussed the term complex problem yet, and I don't want to muddy too many jargon waters. So for our purposes, a complex problem in this space is a systems problem. So we're going to focus now on how we use this for a systems problem. So the research journey essentially posited that most methods fit somewhere across this quadrant. So that somewhere along the role of the informant and the purpose of research. The role of the informant we have at the far left, it's experts trying to understand or explain a phenomena. And at the far right, this is about information is gathered for and by the community. And then on our sort of vertical axis, we have at the bottom, the purpose of research is, again, just to understand a phenomena, write a paper. And at the top, we have this idea that the purpose of the research is to seek themes and understand the world around you. And our hypothesis with the research journey was that most methods, not all of them, but most methods could be understood as fitting somewhere along this. Now, the reason I bring this up is not to sort of pump my tires. This paper's fine. But the key is that what we found was that every single one of the researchers we talked to, and these were people from across the globe dealing with issues often in the sort of social ecological space, but always with a systems lens, is that no one stayed in one quadrant for the entirety of their work on any project. They tended to move around. And that was because they were responding to the system in which they were working. So a good example, and I'm going to be overly summarizing this, was an ecologist who was trying to understand some very particular what they thought were natural phenomena in the Everglades in Florida. And so they started sort of with a lot of traditional methods that they would have used to understand natural phenomena. But it was about halfway through that they realized that they weren't dealing with exclusively natural phenomena. They were instead dealing with millennia old indigenous sort of aquacultures that had evolved into what looked like a relatively natural space from their Western eyes. So then they had to bring in both anthropologists and elders from that nation to sort of help understand what was really going on. And that was extremely challenging for these researchers. They weren't used to working in that way, but it ultimately produced much better work. So I have two big conclusions from this graph that I think are really important. The first is this idea that I want you to start your analysis where you're comfortable. Every one of the researchers we did started where they were most comfortable. But I don't want you to stop there. I want you to let the system sort of respond to you. What is it telling you? What is it sort of pushing you towards? And just like the researchers in Florida, don't try to paper over that or force it into your methods. Instead, explore sort of ways that either people have used other methods to answer this question, or that you can bring different approaches and bring in different voices. The more robust your research journey, the more confident you will feel in your systems map. And the more confident you will feel too in drawing your boundaries. Because you don't start necessarily with hard and fast boundaries. You start where you're comfortable, and then you let the system take you where you need to go. You may find ultimately that the boundaries you end up drawing are not the ones that you initially began with. And that's not because you were wrong. It's because the system is revealing itself as you are studying it. Making the invisible visible often requires a lot of self-work and a lot of self-exploration, and a lot of sort of understanding of the limitations of our particular methods and our particular approaches. Whenever I do systems mapping exercises in my classes, we can do 6 or 7 maps. And they always have something in common, but they also display the lenses that the groups have brought to them. And in some cases, this has been simply additive. Like, we'll have a group that's very focused on entrepreneurship. So if they map Calgary, they're thinking about how you start a small business. And another group that's very sort of outdoor focused. So when they map Calgary, they're focused more on what are the trail systems? How do you get to Banff? All that kind of things. But they can sometimes also be transformative. So they can be someone whose epistemology or experience is so different from where you started that it allows you to see the system in a new way. And, this has sometimes even surprised me. We've had students in class who have challenged the epistemological limitations of sort of the Western view, and have insisted that we think about how to incorporate multiple voices in this space. So start with what you know, but let the system guide you, because realistically, no systems analysis stays in one method, because methods aren't meant to be covering, they're meant to help us answer questions. And complex systems have lots of questions embedded in them. So you may not necessarily find all you're looking for with one answer. So I promised I wouldn't talk that much, and I talked a lot more than I wanted to. It is kind of my job, so at least I enjoy it. I guess that's the plus. So I want to sort of take a moment, and I want to I'm going to stop sharing, but take this creepy circle of children as an indication that this is now the time that we want to hear from you. So do you have a problem in mind? Are you looking for some feedback as to whether or not you're taking a systems lens? Do you have some thoughts about the system you want to explore? And perhaps most importantly, are you hitting snags? And is there some way that we can collectively really think about this in a meaningful way? So I'm going to stop sharing. Now we have 92 participants on this call. So this is going to be a question of coordination and patience, I think. So Tash has turned her camera back on, so she's coming back to me, which is thankful. We work best as a team, Tash and I. So we want to sort of open up the floor. So either you can put your comments in the chat, I will read them out and then provide interesting answers. Or if you'd much rather, of course, you can turn off your microphone. There are a bit of coordination issues there, so you may want to put your hand up if that works better for you. The chat is simpler, realistically, but I want to make sure that people feel as safe as possible. So I see we have a comment. Sorry, I need to scroll the way down. Are people pleasure seeking, what? Oh, creepy circle of children. I am confused.
Hi, Catherine. So we'll actually direct students to use the hand raise function. So if you click
Perfect.
on the bottom of your screen, there should be a reactions, and Amy, one of our project coordinators, is keeping track of the list of students who may have questions. When I call on your name, you will be able to unmute your mic. So if you do have a question, please feel free to use the reactions hand raise button in the bottom of your screen there in the menu bar. Additionally, if you do have questions and would not like to speak them out, you can also drop them in the comment box here, and we will read them out and address them.
So while we're waiting for that, I see someone's put a comment in the comment box about global systems. So that is not too broad. What it might mean, though, is you might lose some of those lower layers, or you might have to make decisions about where you sort of dive deeply and where you stay at the global level. Realistically, most of the issues you're looking at likely will have a global component. So it's more a question of sort of making that choice. The simplest way to do this, so this is going to sound like sloganeering, but you have to make a choice about as simple as possible and no simpler. If it's too simple, you'll lose explanatory power. But if it's too messy, it's hard to actually explain it. But a lot of systems problems exist at the global level. So things like, here's where I'm going to start spitballing, so I might run myself into some trouble. But if you're looking at something like the oceans, that's a global issue. You can't sort of look at the ocean only from a Canadian perspective. And so you would need to have that global level really articulated. Now, other things may have a global element, but the global level may not necessarily be explanatory for your particular purpose in the system. So then you can sort of say, I acknowledge it, but I need to move on. It's that kind of decision you have to make. How does this help me explain sort of the purpose I am interested in? All right, should we help children around the world get along with each other because of their differences? Yes. Yes. I'm going to go on a political limb here and say yes. I chose the creepy image on the end because they sort of seemed raceless, and I thought that was a plus. Don't, limitations of free images on slides are true and real. So another comment is, would this recorded session be available to review later? Yes, well, absolutely. I see a hand up. Ignatius? Oh, I just lost you.
All right, you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the explanation and everything. I'm happy to be part of this wonderful group. But my problem I seek to address is a bit political, and I don't know how I would be able to achieve that. I mean, looking at where you guys are going and what we seek to achieve together, I am concerned because I will be looking at something emission related. So I don't know how best that would fit into the competition.
So I can provide I can provide some feedback, but I'm also happy if Tash and Amy want to jump in. In terms of controversial issues, go ahead, be controversial. The way we actually like to say is be spicy. That's like the way at least I talk about it. But if you are looking at something that potentially could offend people, the bigger thing there is thinking about how you will present it in such a way that will allow people to sort of come into it. Not the analysis itself, if it's robust and strong, that should be sort of helpful. You said you were looking at emissions, I think you said?
I'm looking at like for climate change.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Control,
I mean,
right.
I would fully encourage you to look at this issue. First of all, just put the controversy aside, put it aside for a second. Secondly, as I said, the big benefit here is making the invisible visible, and the inaction of people on climate change is one of those examples of things that, that's an invisibility problem, right? In terms of participating in the challenge, I think you'll find this is a space where you can be controversial. As long as the analysis is strong, then you can sort of come at things. We've had some very challenging subjects, at least at the Mount Royal level, where people have sort of basically pointed out that we have quite a racist country. And it's been a process, but a strong analysis based on sort of good data, and defining good data is a bit challenging, but good data is going to be contingent on your system. With your system, you're going to have a lot of access to scientific information. With other systems where you're looking at potentially issues of race, you may have to deal with those epistemological divides. But if you have good evidence, then what you really need to do when you're thinking about this is more how you present it. So how are you going to bring people into a controversial issue so that they can feel that they have some responsibility, but also some opportunity to act? And this can be sometimes about holding up a bit of a mirror. But we tend to find with the controversial issues that if you present people with something where they can walk alongside you, then they are more likely to be engaged with what you're doing. I know that's kind of vague, and I apologize, but I think as long as you have strong data, and with something like climate change, you're going to have probably a global component. So you may want to think about a nested system with the levels. So you have the global level, maybe a regional level, and then sort of going down, that kind of almost like a funnel. That may be helpful. But once you do that, it's really more about sort of allowing people to walk alongside you in your storytelling. That has been my experience. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah.
You suggested it wasn't.
Thank you. We will go to Daisy, who has a question.
So I have a question. So is it like any sort of disciplines research topic will be accepted? And because we're thinking about something smart grid related for community energy supply. And so we're just wondering, would that be like too technical instead of like, I just not sure would that fit into the system thinking?
I have two answers for you, but I think Tash wants to briefly talk about the 4 categories before I give my other answer. Do you want to talk about those 4?
Sure, I can. So as you may have noticed, if you've gone to the Map the System Canada website or to the global website, there are 4 theme areas or track areas: economic, health, climate, and social. Those are not there to limit any of the research projects that you might be looking into, as well as the idea of a systems reset. We will be accepting all research questions, all how might we questions in various areas, recognizing that these 4 track areas all intertwine. These 4 track areas were identified as areas that have been most researched in the past throughout the system. And the purpose was really to provide additional resources in these 4 areas to students. So if you visit our website, there is, articles that we suggest reading or different tools related to these 4 track areas, however, recognizing that they do intertwine. So if you are looking at something that you feel might not fall into one of these track areas, what I would recommend is continue going into your systems analysis, and it may become more clear and apparent of to which of these various track areas it falls into. So if you are looking at something like climate, you might find that this actually fits better into the social category once your area and scope becomes more defined. You could be looking at a climate crisis with an emphasis on how this impacts a certain population or demographic of people. And you see it is a climate issue, but it is also a social issue. Just like an economic issue may also be a social issue, and vice versa. Catherine?
So and that really leads me to my second point, the second point that I was hoping to make on that one, is that I can see why you might be worried it's not a systems problem, but the issue strikes me with something like, well, actually with emissions too, just to link back to Ignatius's question, is it's not so much the science of the issue, it's the politics or the social issue around it. That's what tends to make the systems analysis interesting, is that being able to sort of think not just about what's happening, but why is action not happening? Or why are certain choices being made at the expense of others? That's where the systems analysis comes in. It's where the politics and the cultural and the social piece, that's where you can start to sort of appreciate the complexity of the issue. With something like climate change, we're often looking at the social ecological tension there between sort of the human environment and the natural environment. There's a really great book about that. It's kind of old. Sorry, I just moved my office around. This is a really great book. It's called Barriers and Bridges. It's a little old, but it deals with this idea of how people have not dealt with the environment very well when they've been trying to make decisions, and it may be helpful for both of those questions. But that's often really where we start to see the systems issue come in, and the complexity come in, is around human decision making, and I think that would help both of you guys.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
I am just trying to appreciate the whole concept. I mean, the system challenge or system issues being maybe a systematic issue that has been as a result of maybe human actions and inactions, right? Looking at the political aspect, the economic aspect, the ecological aspect, and trying to make sense out of how our inactions and actions has really drag us back. It has affected our control of what we need to do to, let's say, achieve economic or environmental sustainability. That sort of, that's what I'm thinking. I don't know whether I am in the right path, because
no, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Okay. And I don't normally, so you guys aren't my students. I don't think any of my students are on this call. But I don't like to project too much, but what I would recommend that you do then is sort of look globally, but also pick a few places you want to do a little bit of a deep dive to understand, to understand sort of the different, you can do this 2 ways. The simpler way is to do them all at the same time frame. So like what are 3 different countries responding to it now? And you can do that one of 2 ways. You can look at countries with comparable economics and comparable cultures and how they're responding. That way you can really look at sort of how very specific political issues on the ground make a big difference. Or you can look for points of massive contrast, like countries where there's very different values and very different beliefs and how those are articulated. The other one you can do is look at something over time. So the United States over time has had very different policies around things like emissions. And that then leads to you could do some really interesting questions about why is it that why is it that Richard Nixon, pushes the EPA and he's a Republican and in the modern Republican sort of then, but then we also have Donald Trump. Like what, so you could do it from same jurisdiction over time, or you could look at across jurisdictions. And that's, sorry.
I was saying even in Canada too, we can look at the liberals against the conservatives on how they are fighting their heads over the climate change.
And that would be, yeah, and that you could even, there's even a historical element there because, you know, I hope I'm not dating myself, but you know, Brian Mulroney actually fights against acid rain, and then you know, and so you can really look at these things over time. So that would be another, and that would be great. I think that would be really good. I would really support that. Sorry, just in case. So this is called Barriers and Bridges. It's a co-authored book, but it may be helpful. I saw someone asked. The editors on it are Lance Gunderson, C.S. Halling, and Stephen Light. So these are the same, Gunderson and Halling are the same guys who invented the panarchy cycle. If any of you have been introduced to that, same thing. And I'll make sure that that's in the chat. Sorry, I see lots of hands. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, we will go over to Kelly.
Hi, Natasha and Catherine. My name is Kelly. I'm from SFU, and I guess my main concern is kind of organizing the ideas, for example, like differentiating problems, gaps, lever of change, and I guess I've been using these subheadings as my guideline, but I feel like it's quite, like you said at the beginning, like differentiating problem and issue is not very easy. So maybe I'll start with my system problem. My team and I will be looking at temporary foreign workers in Canada and how COVID has exacerbated their situation. And a few points that we've noticed was there's accessibility hurdles in accessing resources. For example, there's physical barriers. Like for example, if they live in the suburbs and most of the resources are in downtown, things like that, there's that issue. There's issues of public government-run organizations that have office hours from 9 to 5, but maybe they're working 16 hours a day. And I guess there's the other barrier of language barriers. Most of these workers, for example, 2/3 of migrant workers are from Mexico, so they're Spanish speaking, but maybe Service Canada, they don't have enough translators, or they don't have those kind of tailored services. So yeah, there's a bunch of barriers, but I think my main concern is, should I be diving into one of them, or should I just name it as kind of the issues that temporary foreign workers face in Canada, and then kind of have the other barriers as
yeah, I mean, first of all, let me just validate that you've done some great work. So it strikes me that there's a couple of options that you have here. So first of all, you may want to think about this from a journey mapping perspective. So how would any of these barriers show up for a temporary foreign worker sort of on a semi-regular basis? And where would they show up in their journey? So are they constant? So the language barrier is a constant. Like I said, I'm from Southern Ontario, and we rely pretty heavily on temporary foreign workers in the farming industry. So you know, I'm familiar with the fact that for them, like the language issue is consistent and constant, whereas other things may be periodic. So that might help. So just in terms of organizing your thinking, one of the issues, just as an aside with the term gap, is I think it is leading to some ambiguity, because there's gaps in what we've researched, and then there's absences in the system. And those are not the same thing, right? We may not have information on something, and that may or may not mean it exists, but there may be barriers in the system or gaps in the system, like places where people can't go, or places where we don't know where decision is being made. And so I think sometimes we risk conflating those two. So if you have subcategories that you have adequately defined so that they are analytically distinct, that's a great way to start that. Do you think doing a bit of a journey may be helpful? As an aside to that, it may actually make sense to identify something where you feel that this barrier is potentially either actionable or is being undervalued. So it may be that you find that there's a lot of focus on a few barriers, but there's one or two where you're finding this is actually really important and people aren't talking about it. And if that's the case, or there's one that's just, you're like, wow, this is so interesting, why don't we do something about it? That you could dive more deeply into that one in particular. But I think thinking about it from a journey perspective, so you can identify those things that are chronic and constant, and those things that are sort of periodic, will help you also do some of that sorting to sort of figure between like, what might be obvious sort of things that are, again, actionable versus things that are sort of things that are more cultural and deep, and we need to think about them and be aware of them, versus things where like the government may be like actively making people's lives like, no, you need this other form and this form, and you need the form that you need after the form before the form. And anyone who's had to deal with government knows that that can be a bit of an issue. So I would use maybe that additional sort of journey map just to sort of help reorient your thinking, again, from the perspective of someone who's actually trying to navigate this.
Yeah, that's actually very helpful, because I was thinking of maybe I can do not like a quick flow chart, but just see if I can see more barriers when I can kind of map out something where the workers coming from Mexico going to the airport and kind of and see what the barriers.
And that, I think that'll be helpful. I think there's a risk sometimes when we're doing this work, and this applies to everybody, that the thing you discover you didn't know, but you find it in your research, it may run the risk of becoming vibrant in your brain. Like it may run the risk of like, you're like, oh, that's new to me, I need to tell everyone. And it may, that vibrancy is more of a function of the discovery sort of factor than it is its actual relevance in the system. We get a hit of dopamine when we discover something, and or when we find a pattern. We're like, yeah, pattern. My mother is very guilty of this, always finding patterns, but it feels good, so we tend to run to it. So yeah, a flow chart would really, I think, help.
And I guess just one more comment I wanted to make was on Ignatius's when he asked about, you know, how some topics it does offend a certain section of the industry. And I feel like I did kind of face a little bit of that when I was looking into this problem, because a lot of the temporary foreign workers, they have fear of employer retaliation.
Yeah. So,
you know, for example, just being sent home and whatnot. And so it was a very interesting section, but where we didn't really want to dive deep into that, because, you know, it's if we enter as a third party and we have the good intentions of, you know, changing their workers' working conditions and living conditions, but what if they risk, you know, losing their job? That's even worse. So I do feel you on that, Ignatius, on the kind of there's a business, they're doing a business, so it's that's quite a different aspect.
No, I want to, for a moment, I want to validate both Ignatius and Kelly's point, but I also want to sort of reach out and sort of on some level to everyone here and say, this can be very difficult work. Sometimes you do have to make those choices about what you are going to do and not going to do, who you want to piss off and who you won't piss off. Now, be aware that the spotlight effect is real. And probably fewer people are looking at what you're doing than you think. But the reality is that, you know, and I've seen this time and time again, you know, you're drawn to this because you think this is the opportunity to talk about this thing I really care about, this big, scary, awful thing. And I hope it is, but I'm not sure we're doing enough. And I don't mean we in terms of me and Tash, because Tash and Amy are worked to the bone. But I wonder if the challenge more broadly is doing enough to sort of prepare you guys for the emotional crud that can sometimes be involved in this. Like, I know it's Friday, I should just swear, but even when I was doing my own doctoral research, which didn't take an explicit systems lens, like, you know, uncovering racism, uncovering sexism, uncovering ableism, uncovering inaction. Inaction actually really sucks when you discover inaction and you're like, why aren't you doing something? This is so obvious and it's important. And so I do want to stress that I think it is important when you do this, that you, whatever sort of having either people you can go talk to, just be like, I just need to like vent for like 5 minutes, or whether it's sort of having a professor who you can go to who's not going to be patronizing, you know, in this process. or just even some sort of coping mechanisms, whether it's running or walking or weightlifting. I always find weightlifting is really helpful when I'm really angry. Like, just like, that's where you get that extra rep. But the key is, I'm not trying to devalue it. I'm trying to say that, right now we don't have a better avenue. And it's so frustrating. And people will tell you, oh, use that frustration to like dive deeply. It's like, yeah, but sometimes you can't take any more frustration and you feel as if you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. So I want to acknowledge that if you've had that experience, it doesn't mean you're a failure. It means that you're dealing with an issue that is chronic and big and scary. Doesn't mean you have to run away from it, but I also know it sucks butts. That's as far as I'm going to get down that line. I'm sorry, Tash.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Kelly. I am going to move over to Mark and then Christian. We are reaching the end of our time here, so I want to make sure there's space for both of those questions, and then we will wrap up with whichever ones are in the comments. So Mark, I will hand it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Natasha. Hi, Catherine. Thank you for the presentation. It was really, really helpful. I do have a question regarding drawing boundary for system. So when we first identify a system, as you said, it's really important that we look into the different aspects of that system, like the jurisdiction and then cultural and kind of like make a boundary on which aspect we want to dive into. But my question is, when we're analyzing a system, we expect to break it down into smaller subsystems to better identify their interaction with each other and how them together make the big picture. So my question is the approach that we use to draw the boundary between those smaller systems the same way we draw the boundary for a bigger system? Because like certain components of different subsystems do have us explain certain things that happening on other subsystems, but they are not necessarily the same one, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
No, it's a fantastic question. So I'm really glad you asked. I'll try to be brief because I realize that, we are running out of time. So in some cases, the boundary will be essentially the same. In some cases, if you go deeper, so you'll be looking at the same jurisdictional area, but not in all cases. And so what you really want to do is just have at your core that sort of question of what is the purpose I'm trying to understand? And if you find that you have flexible boundaries, that's okay. If you find that something is relevant, let's say at the meso level, just to pick out randomly, that may not necessarily be relevant at the macro or micro level, that's okay, as long as it helps to explain that purpose. One of the things that we find is that you don't draw your boundaries once and walk away. You'll come back and you'll notice that they might vary a little bit. The key is that you do need to have a point at which you say, I'm stopping my analysis. And as long as you can sort of say, and I stopped it for this reason because I've hit the limitations of the explanation for this purpose, I think you'll find yourself, you at least will have something to sit back on. One of the questions that you often get asked at the more senior levels or when in the competition will be around sort of, well, why didn't you include this other piece? And so being able to explain that will be helpful. But yes, some people, it'll be the same boundaries all the way down. It'll be turtles all the way down. But in other cases, it won't necessarily work that nicely and that firmly, and that's okay. It's just you have to be able to have that rationale of what is the purpose I'm trying to understand, and therefore why does this boundary make more sense here? In some systems I've mapped, the boundary at the global or macro level is enormous, and the boundary at the local level is very, very tiny. And in other cases, I actually find that there's no sort of linear progression or degression. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, we'll look more into that.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Mark, for the question. I will hand it over to Christian.
Yes, hello. We are having some problems in regards to our topic, if you will. We're really interested in education, and especially, I don't know where I should start with this question, but we're interested in education, and especially how examination and the values of the education systems in the different countries affect how, like, the outcome for the students and for the pupils. and how it has an effect on the mental health and the like life skills that they adapt, and how they view themselves as individuals, as successful individuals, and their self-esteem and so on, all these factors. But the thing that I want to ask more specifically about is that it's very difficult for us to be specific in how to start the system, how to start mapping, because it is so ingrained in tradition and culture and politics. And each time we switch country or school, it changes. The entire dynamic changes. So how do we like grasp this problem? How do we control it?
So
So
first,
we can map
first
it
of
out.
all, take a deep breath. I would, okay, personally, I would do a map for each of those individually, and then
At
I
what
would.
level then? Locally or
So what I would probably do a journey map, because as much as, and this is actually a very important gap that you're probably encountering, we as students go from program to program to program, and we are one person. But the programs are relatively I'm not sure about every country, but at least in Canada, like there's not a lot of communication between the levels. So I would actually potentially do a bit of a journey map for us, like a typical student in any of the jurisdictions that you're looking at, and sort of how they would go through the system. You could even, again, if you have Canada as an example, there could even be, you can have more than one journeyer on a map. And so if you had, let's say you're someone in Alberta and they go to Catholic school versus public school, sort of what would that look like? And so you could potentially do it almost like drawing a landscape. That would be sort of my first suggestion, is to actually do for each jurisdiction that has a different set of official rules around curriculum, is to have your own map. And then potentially sort of look at where they compare. Analytically, what you would want to do is have relatively comparable sort of sets of questions across that. Visually, however, there's a lot of potential fun to be had here. So when it comes to presenting it, once you've sort of done that work, you might find things that are sort of relevant to pull out. But one of the things I would do is I would stop worrying so much about drawing systems map right now. And I would start by sort of doing kind of a relatively high level scan of the jurisdictions that you're interested in terms of what is their curriculum, how is it developed, and sort of general rules, so that you can start to see whether or not there are points of commonality, not similarity, but points of commonality. So is curriculum designed in one place? So for instance, in Alberta, curriculum is actually designed at the provincial level. So where is curriculum design would be a good question. Sort of where are, what's the role of employers? So you can start to sort of ask those questions of all the different jurisdictions, but let those questions emerge somewhat organically from what the lit's actually telling you. And I think that will sort of reduce the feeling of, oh my God, like we can't get started, it's so big. And instead, what you'll start to find is that in the literature itself, there may be similar questions, there may be similar issues. So to start to sort of find out what those are, and then look at where those sort of what we call a boundary object, those things everyone agrees are important, how do they disagree about what to do about it? So if everyone agrees that curriculum is important, how do they address it? They address it this way. Does another jurisdiction address it that way? In Alberta, it's actually a very fraught process, politically speaking. And so that would be something you would take into account. Then another question, a lot of people take the idea of mental health is important. They say it's important. So there's another potential boundary object. How do they look at mental health? How does one jurisdiction, is one jurisdiction checking in with kids and talking about like, did you go outside today? I know in Norway, they actually have like rules around going outside for a certain amount of time every day as part of the education. Or in Sweden, they do fika. Which is like, I would have loved to have done fika as a child, probably for the coffee. Fika is coffee break or coffee. And they even do it for children. Whereas in Alberta, we were just like, hey, Belle said, let's talk. So my point is you might be able to identify those common nodes or boundary objects where there does seem to be some, where you can start to actually compare.
Yeah, all right. Okay,
that would be my 2 suggestions.
Okay. Yeah, so we have to choose a layer to scan at, and then try to see these commonalities.
Yeah, so I would start with a layer and then anticipate you're going to go down once you've picked that layer, because it's just you have to start somewhere. That's actually the biggest thing, is starting. So start at like a layer, like the decision making layer, and then sort of go down from there.
All right.
I would start.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for your great questions. We are getting close to our wrap up. I do see there is one more hand, so I will ask Catherine's permission, as long as if we can go to that last question there, and then we will wrap up for today.
Okay, so is it okay if I ask my question? Like,
I'll give you
really,
two.
Yeah, go ahead.
One.
okay, really sorry. So
No, don't bother.
Okay. So the thing is that our group, I think maybe that I'm struggling a bit with the scope of what we want to investigate. So what we want to investigate is how COVID has affected civil liberties, in particular in democracies, because we've seen like lots of alarming trends, like on a pretty much global scale. If like I saw this one post which was like the democracy index rating of countries before and after COVID has drastically decreased. So I was wondering if, as a question, that scope is too big, and if it is too big, how do I like make that more focused, and what can I do to sort of make it a more coherent system, if that makes any sense?
As a starting question, it's not too big. As a final question, you might find that you've narrowed a bit. What I would, and I'm putting on my professor hat, so I'm talking to you more as an instructor than I am sort of exclusively assistant as an analyst. What I would start is I'd go back to that metric that you saw, where you saw this decrease, and I would sort of start interrogating it. I would say, okay, how was this created? What are their metrics? How do they get their data? And I would use that as my beginning stage, because I think that will give you something to hold on to when you get started. As you do that, let your sort of boundaries move a little bit. You're likely going to be looking at more than one national system, so country, at the national level, but with local relevancy, like with sort of, what are people doing in Chicago? What are people doing in Toronto? What are people doing in London, England? Paris might actually show up, but I would start with that thing that you found that caught your attention and try to figure out, how was it created? Where did they get their sources? And then use that as sort of your beginning guide. And I flip that to everyone on this call. Starting is hard. It's hard. So if you can identify a study that got your attention, or a news article that got your attention, and you can start there, then I think you at least have the beginning of your sort of your movement in the right direction. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for answering the question. And so in regards to the system, is like, if I'm looking at different countries, right? Would it be okay if they're like not entirely related? Because because I was thinking of looking at Canada, America, of course, but the thing that really got my attention was like the distribution of COVID vaccines in Israel, and how the Israeli population, the Israeli citizens, have gotten almost 80 to 90% of all their civilians vaccinated. But in Gaza, in the West Bank, and the Palestinians, COVID, there have been little to none COVID vaccine distribution there. So I was wondering if...
Yeah, of course you could. I mean, as long as you have okay. So again, analytically, a really good study would probably compare relatively similar countries. But I would point out that Israel is a democracy. It has a long relationship with both Canada and the United States, very close relationship with the United States. And so I think that's not a radical comparison. What would more be the issue is, let's say you were comparing, can I use historical countries so that nobody can accuse me of being racist? So let's say you were comparing like the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, and like a small island nation. And you're like, why does this small island nation not seem to have the same policies? It's like, it's the obvious, like the comparison is too big. So with what you've described, I think I would be fine with it. I mean, there's always that question when you're doing comparisons. Have you gone too far so that, it's hard to distinguish, or are you going too similar so that, you're making a mountain out of a molehill? And I think you're doing okay. And I would say I would start with that study that you found, but as long as you have a strong rationale. If this was a graduate work, we'd spend more time sort of going through your rationale, but it's this more of a fun competition. I will say, however, you know, that's going to be an interesting subject, and you're going to sort of run up against a lot of potential strands, things like civil liberties, technology, psychology. So you want to make sure that you have a sense of what the purpose that you're interested in is, so that you can sort of say it, you can give yourself permission to stop.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much again for taking my question, extending the
No
time.
problem. COVID is a classic example of an external shock on a system. It exposes existing problems, and it makes evident things that we were sort of walking alongside of without necessarily dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I will wrap up today, so join me in thanking Catherine for leading our workshop today. Like I said, Catherine is housed at the Mount Royal University and has been involved with both Map the System MRU, Map the System Canada, and Map the System Global, and has provided assistance to students across Canada in their Map the System research and process. I will do a quick reminder of a couple key dates. So the final submission deadline for your Map the System research is April 2nd. This might vary per institution, so please make sure that you are checking in with your local educator. Additionally, each institution does have an educator, a Map the System educator for their institution. For lots of these questions and further supports, please connect with your local educators, as they will have multiple supports and resources available for you as well, and may have additional insights and coaching for you. As always, you can always visit the Map the System Canada website, where we do have a resource page, and we do have the 2021 track areas and resources available. This is where we will house and continuously update with multiple, with various resources. One that I will direct you to, as we did see multiple questions about it today, is the Student's Guide to Mapping a System, where you can find examples of the Iceberg model, stakeholder maps, as well as journey maps in that guidebook. It will also give you wonderful tips on how to prepare your 10-minute presentation, which is also part of Map the System. As part of it is the research component, the bibliography, the research analysis, and the systems map, but part of it is also storytelling and how you tell the story of the system and your learning journey throughout Map the System Canada, which is equally important. Thank you again for joining us today. I apologize that we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but thank you all for showing up, and I wish you well in your research. If at any point in time you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to us. My contact information is on the website, and I hope to see you all at we can't see you all at the Canadian final, but I hope to see many of your faces at the Map the System Canada final in May. So thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon, and I wish you well.